if not soon, it may already be now, where if you're talking to an MSP and they don't understand managed controls, you're going to start talking to other people who do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think MSPs need to understand this in and out themselves and then take the time to educate their current clients on this. Make sure their sales team is aware of it so they can educate prospects on it. And it's really going to help shape the prospect's perspective of I'm just trying to find a company that can manage our IT to I'm looking for a trusted advisor to my company that is going to do so much more than just manage our IT.
I love it, guys. Yeah, this is really the big. Don't look at and stop treating compliance as an expense. It isn't. It's an opportunity. It's a revenue opportunity. You have to be invested in it. You have to be able to do the work and to be able to understand the concepts. And we'll help you understand the material. All right. Managed controls. What are they? How does it differ from a shared control? What's a shared responsibility control? These are terms that we're starting to hear a lot of MSPs throw around. A fair number of you understand this and actually know how to and are actually implementing this through your managed services to your customers. And there are some of you who may not exactly know what this is and think you're doing it, but you may have some doubts. So you came to the right place. We're going to talk about this in great detail. We're going to take the complicated and make it simple. It's what we do. It's what we specialize in. Joining me today, Kyle Murphy and Chris Vio from Team MSP Alliance. Guys, thanks a bunch for coming in. And maybe the first stop is, what is a managed control? Chris, that's up your swim lane. Why don't you tackle that one? A managed control. What is it?
Managed control is the cyber verifies reasoning of mixed controls, where an MSP is hosting or managing IT infrastructure on behalf of either another service provider or a customer, and the managed control is the tested version of their control that goes downstream to the customer. So the customer's inheriting a compliant control from the MSP that's been tested and vetted through the Unified Certification Standard.
So we call it managed control because it's quite native to the concept of managed IT or managed IT services that has been around since the 90s. We may come back to this, but you mentioned either the MSP is managing or hosting. There are a lot of MSPs that we talk to who say, I don't have to worry about audit or certifications or managed controls because I don't host anything. Now, it's true that probably over 90% of the MSPs around the planet don't have a data center, right? Meaning that they don't own or run a data center. They may use a third-party colo. They may use a cloud infrastructure like AWS or Azure. Could you maybe talk about why managed controls is so important and why maybe the idea that if I don't host, then I don't have to worry about this is maybe not the right way to think about it?
Yeah. The importance of the managed control, I think, ultimately is assurance for the customer and for the MSP or the service provider that is being tested and demonstrating that internal control. And so the customer's trust as a trusted partner, right? The MSP as a trusted partner, and the customer's reliance on an MSP that's using a managed control can ultimately leverage that MSP's report or certification or documentation. And so it just is a time and effort saver when you're asked to provide compliance documentation.
Yeah, it's not a good proposition for MSPs to basically say in 2025, hey, I don't host the data, therefore you don't need to look at me. I mean, Kyle, that's you probably get that a little bit earlier in the relationship, but that's not a winning proposition if you're an MSP and you want to win business in any sector, much less a regulated sector.
Agreed. Yeah, certainly a common misconception. An MSP might have a client ask them for a SOC 2 report, and they're confused at why they would need a SOC 2 audit when they don't actually host the data. And then come to find out they are responsible for the data, and therefore the SOC 2 is applicable for them, and they end up having to go down that path.
Yeah, and that really gets to, guys, does it not, the managed control or the shared responsibility control concept goes right into what Kyle said, Chris, that the asking of an audit report like a SOC 2 or an MSP Verify for that matter. When the MSP gets asked, we hear two, maybe more, but at least two scenarios where the MSP is either being asked for the audit report themselves, and then they immediately turn and say, well, I don't have one, but I can go get my cloud provider and I'm going to pass their audit report off. Or they look at, well, let's help the customer get their audit report if they don't have one, which is a very big scenario, but kind of different, right? Compliance as a service, more like. What's your assessment of why this is happening? It's not past the buck. I mean, but it does happen a lot where people just don't understand why people are asking for these reports and what they mean.
Yeah. Good question. I think the importance or the misconception around using a service provider and I'm distinguishing managed service provider from a tool that may be called a service provider, an external service provider. For example, your ticketing system is a good one. If you're using a ticketing system, then you would want to ask the ticketing system, how are you managing the data that we give you, right? Because we know that a ticket includes customer contact information and sometimes sensitive information about the work being performed inside of the environment that the managed service provider is ultimately delivering. And so when you have a managed control, consequently, you don't know it, but you're actually inheriting the ticketing platform's compliance controls at that place. The ticketing platform is responsible for the security of the platform, but you are responsible for security inside the platform. They won't attest to backing up the data, or they won't attest to securing the data inside the ticketing system once you've logged in to your tenant. Once you've used your credentials to gain access into the system, now it's up to you to make sure that responsibility, that data is secure, available, and confidential. And so that managed control translates itself to a service provider who's providing services to a customer where the spread of information is multifaceted. You have a tool you're using that's storing some data. You're also using a documentation tool or an internal tool. You're storing data there. You may be using some type of communication platform, right? So that shared responsibility nebulous starts to unravel. And so they're being asked to provide these reports because the managed service providers using these tools to deliver a lot of those services.
Yeah. It's transparency, right? I mean, Kyle, this gets to the ability for the MSP to sell their services. And when a customer asks them for information about how they deliver services and the MSP says, oh, you don't want to talk to me. You want to talk to the guy behind me, my data center. That's the guy that you're really talking about. It almost sounds, it's like they're intending to mislead. And I don't want to accuse any MSP of doing that, but at some point there's a responsibility, is there not, that the MSP has to say, look, this is what we have done. This is our report. This is our credential, which also includes the due diligence we did on our vendor, that data center back there.
Yes.
Right?
Yep, all tied in with those commitments that the MSP is making to the clients, endpoint protection or patch management, network monitoring, all different examples of things that they could be providing for the client. And some of those tools, most of those tools will have their own security needs that they'll be needing to be in compliance with, whether that's SOC 2 or another framework. But ultimately, the MSP is delivering that service to the clients. They're managing that and they are responsible for that compliance standing within their own house.
And that really gets to Kyle as well. That's the downstream opportunity that many MSPs are hearing about right now, right? vCISO, vCIO, compliance as a service, right? If you don't understand and have managed controls, firmly in grasp, like you don't have those in your MSP practice, you can't really fully unlock the opportunity of compliance as a service. Right. I mean, that may be a bit of a learning curve for some MSPs, that they think of compliance as a service that you can resell. It's not. You're the service. You, the MSP. It's
Yeah.
all coming from you,
Good
right?
point.
I mean,
Yes.
so all right, let's talk about managed controls in the context of a typical vendor setup. And Chris, maybe we can get some just conversation going about what would an average SMB service provider want to be looking at in terms of managed controls for a typical setup. So let's just start with an RMM, a ticket platform, some security like an EDR, MDR, and a backup, right? I mean, there's many others, right? But those are kind of the fundamentals. I think there are the unique managed controls for each tool that the MSP would be responsible for with the tool vendor to deliver ultimately the MSP's controls down to the customer. If that makes sense, could you maybe walk us through what some of those might look like based on your experience?
Yes, I could. So I think to Kyle's point, he touched on a really important concept when it comes to delivering this, which is that customer commitment. And so how that it translates itself into the managed control using a tool, security of the tool, security in the tool, and a very familiar concept, SLA. You can't deliver an SLA without a managed control, because you can't, unless you've built your own ticketing platform, right? You're relying on the availability of that ticketing platform to co-communicate the information from the client to you to your team back to the client, ultimately driven contractually by the SLA agreement. So the managed control in that scenario is one, you're using contracts to manage service agreements to drive the need for the tool. Then you use the tool and the security of the tool to deliver the service. And so you're the proprietary mechanism for that service. That compliance service is ultimately relying on you being diligent and doing things contractually the right way. Then you utilize a tool like a PSA tool or a ticketing tool to deliver that service with respect to the commitment, which is whether it's 12 hours or 24 hours or 3 days or however you have that configuration. And so that tool plays itself, but you ultimately are the service, right? Which is you're using your own internal control to deliver that service, that commitment, that client commitment. Right, so that's certainly one way to do it.
So if an MSP, an average MSP listening to this right now says, all right, I'm trying to make sense. I think this makes sense to me. I'm following it. They're maybe wondering, okay, I have to go get some stuff from my vendors. What is it that I'm going to go to my vendor and get so that my managed control down to my customer is intact, secured, trusted, verified? Can you give us some quick examples of what a vendor request might look like?
Yeah, so to go to the vendor, you're going to want to, I feel like there's a lot that we could touch on here, but the highlights are this, which is take a look at the contract and see what they're guaranteeing to you. Are they managing any of the data inside of the tool? And if we're talking ticketing tool, right? Like if I want to see a SOC report, or I might want to see ISO certification. I want to see some type of compliance attestation, whether it be an assessment that they fill out via you, or they have a public facing compliance report that they can provide, or they have a certification that they've earned in the marketplace. So that's those two things, which is the contract's going to define what they're going to deliver, and then ultimately you're going to verify that against their own internal compliance mechanisms.
So Kyle, now when you're in your scenario where you're talking and working with an MSP who wants to deliver compliance as a service style solutions downstream to a customer, they take what Chris just said, which is they have a tool belt full of tool vendors that they all have unique, not identical by any means, but very unique managed controls that are impacted both by the vendor and by the MSP themselves. And then that control gets influenced and sold downstream to a customer who says, I'm getting something that is good, it's valuable, but it's also secured, even though multiple parties have touched it or are responsible for it at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. To Chris's point, you should be very well aware of what's in your agreements and what services you are providing, and ensure that all the vendors that you're using to deliver those services are in compliance with whatever industry you happen to be in. And then it is a shared responsibility matrix. It's not totally owned by the MSP. So there's certainly going to be items that are still the client is responsible for that the MSP won't have an influence in. But for what the MSP is handling, what's very clearly written out in your agreements, that should all be taken care of and secured.
You don't have to name names, Kyle, but with the MSPs that you're talking to and working with on compliance as a service projects, do you get the sense that the MSP understand the managed control concept, but more importantly, do their customers understand it yet? Because it's the customer that really, in my opinion, might not be fully grasping shared responsibility under a managed control concept. Any thoughts on that?
It's a mixed case. Some don't understand it at all, and after a short call, we're able to help them understand that by using this MSP, they're already a good leap forward towards their compliance goal, and it helps them appreciate their MSP more. It helps the MSP look much better in the eyes of the client. Some that are just more knowledgeable in the compliance world are already aware of what having a compliant MSP is, and that's the reason that they hired that MSP, because they were already meeting a certain compliance standard. But for those clients that don't fully understand it, it's not a very difficult conversation typically to help them get up to speed and really help them understand the value that you're providing for their business.
So there's undeniably a large and rapidly growing segment of the MSP market who, they get an MSP Verify report. Maybe they get a SOC 2, maybe they get an ISO or CMMC or something, but they have their controls set, and then their customers are coming to them saying, MSP, can you help me with this? Chris, I don't see that relationship between customer and MSP as being radically different than the relationship between MSP and vendor. Am I off on that, or is it, what's your take on that parallel?
I think it's a good point. The easiest analogy that I would say is, let's take a healthcare customer, for example, right? Which is, I need to be, when I'm logging into my documentation or my internal mechanism for storing information, right? Be it some type of records or just sensitive information about records. There's a compliance check mark that needs to take place, which is I need to have two-factor enabled in order to do that, right? So perhaps the client doesn't know how to, as simple of a case as it is, they don't know how to make sure that each one of their employees is using two-factor. And so where the client can lean on the expertise of the MSP is that the MSP is using a shared control with a RMM tool that is monitoring client endpoints, these healthcare client endpoints, and making sure flagging systems that aren't enabled with two-factor when it comes to logging into the endpoint, and then also the access points that they're accessing. And so in conjunction with the RMM tool, they also might be using some type of an EDR tool or some type of a centralized access control infrastructure that they're managing for the client, right? And so the healthcare client goes to the MSP and says, hey, I need to make sure that my employees are using two-factor when they log into our our intranet. Okay. And so then consequently, the MSP does the same thing when they're delivering a service. Maybe it's an EDR service. They go to the EDR and they're saying, we want to use EDR, but we also want to resell it under some type of license agreement. We're going to host the EDR tool and then deliver it to our customers. The configuration holds from client to MSP and then from MSP to vendor.
So there are MSPs out there saying, I get the concept at a high level, but I have no idea how I'm going to separate the responsibility of my customers' controls that they have versus the controls they're getting from me, their MSP.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add the complexity of all the different vendors that the MSP is bringing to the relationship, none of which, by the way, the customer has asked for, right? I mean, the customer didn't say, hey, I want you to be using this brand of RMM versus that brand, right? So there's a lot of trust that the customer places in the MSP. So MSPs out there may be saying, look, I don't know who's a vendor versus an external service provider versus a sub-service provider. Is there a tool out there that might help them sort through all this stuff and just make some sense? Because I fear that's probably holding a lot of people back. I wonder if such a tool exists. You guys have any ideas?
Yeah,
They could
Kyle's
use
got an idea.
this
It looks like.
inside Cyber Verify. When we first launched Cyber Verify, it was originally just for MSP maturity and compliance readiness. And through a lot of feedback of our certified MSPs, they asked us if we could create a tool, some type of assessment that they could use to benchmark their clients against a specific framework, and in doing so, identify what is being managed by the MSP, what is not applicable to the client, and what is responsible for the client. And so that is available inside of our Cyber Verify platform, and that tool came about directly from feedback we got from our MSPs. I'll give all the credit to them.
Yeah. No, that was a trick question for those of you out there listening. Chris and Kyle know the answer to that question. They live it every single day. But look, even going through our own audit, it can be complicated to sort out who's responsible for what, right? And that's one of the things that I really love about Cyber Verify as a program, which is that it doesn't say, hey, you have to be knowledgeable about NIST or CIS controls, right? Which is, it's boring reading, right? If anyone is out there gone through like the NIST, 853 or 171, is it 171, 181, 171? Yeah, it's
Sure, there's
not
a
fun.
181 too, though.
It's coming, right? If they don't have
Yeah,
it now, they'll get it.
yeah.
The point is that you have to be in the compliance profession really to understand that stuff, and it's not necessarily easy, and that's just making sense of it, much less implementing it, right? Which is what we're talking about. So I think that the benefit of going through, having used it ourselves, right, having used Cyber Verify to achieve our own certification and audit outcomes, is that it helps me to understand, what do we do? How do we do it? We describe it, and then Cyber Verify takes over and basically does the hard work of saying, okay, this is your control. This is your control and how it impacts your customers, which in this case would be MSPs. And these are your vendors, and this is how those vendors impact your MSP consumers, right? And it takes a lot of that complexity out of it, Chris. That's one of the things that I find hugely beneficial.
Is Yes, I agree. You had mentioned the prompting question, which is how do I separate my customer controls from my internal controls and my MSP controls? And we, not to name any names, but there are some MSPs that are doing this very efficiently through the use of the managed service agreement and baking in managed controls directly into the services that they're delivering to the clients the security platforms, the EDRs and the SIMs and the tools that really make managed controls deliverable, they come standard with the service offering that the client is subscribing to or the client is agreeing to, and then the MSP is committing to providing those services to them in that managed control configuration. Whether or not they use it, it's up to the customer whether or not they utilize it, but it's there, and it's not an optional component of their security configuration.
Yeah. I mean, just listening to you talk about that, Chris, I've seen a lot of these other, GRC tools, which have been around forever, including, fairly elaborate spreadsheets that you can, any GRC tool can be boiled down into a spreadsheet, at the end of the day. But we are not talking about simply mapping out controls here. We're talking about what you said, which is, yes, you understand the control. Are you doing the control? Is that control part of what you deliver? And then what is the impact of your vendors on that control? And what is the type of consumption of your customer on that control? And none of those things is solved by a GRC. That's you as an MSP. I mean, that you nailed it, Chris. It's part of your DNA. It's part of your master service agreement and your service agreement with your customers. It can't really live anyplace else that I could think of.
Yeah, there you could have fragments of it in places. There's opportunity for operational efficiency with those, right? Like you said, in a spreadsheet or a risk assessment or a tool that helps put together, this tool manages this data. This data comes from this source. This source is classified at this level.
So if you're out there and you're still with us, you get this. Maybe some of the more technical things are over your head. Maybe not, right? I mean, even for us, it can get kind of dense. Let's talk about the opportunity because it is significant, right? I mean, if the last 30 years of compliance in the channel has been get an audit, I mean, Kyle, you know this better than anyone. You see how many MSPs are doing this, getting an MSP Verify report, a Cloud Verify report, or SOC 2, or some combination of those solely because their customer is asking them to do it. I mean, it's got to be a fair, I don't know what the percentage is, but there's a good number of those out there.
There's a very rare exception of an MSP that pursues a SOC 2 just for the fun of it. And just because I think.
But does it happen? I mean, I know it
has
happens,
happened a couple of times. Most of the time, it's the MSP wants to start getting into bids on clients that require a SOC 2. I don't know that we've worked with an MSP that actually went down the path of SOC 2 because they just wanted to. We certainly had MSPs that go down the path of MSP Verify for the maturity development of that and preparing for future compliance request.
Yeah. So okay, so if there's a segment of the market which is still growing, that is, they get an audit report because they have to. There's another segment of the market that does it because they want to become better, right? Chris, just listening to all the stuff that you're talking about, when you master manage controls, you're going to be a better MSP, right? I mean, you can't not go through that exercise and not come out with at least an understanding of how to become better, if not actually becoming better.
Yeah. Yes.
Too dramatic? I mean,
no, I think it's not dramatic enough, because what you're doing is the more that you master the managed control element, then the cheaper it becomes for you to deliver the compliance as a service to your customer, which consequently translates into access and easeability to them getting those industry certifications that we're seeing come out, where you will be you're going to be involved. The financial sector is moving in that direction. Healthcare's been there for a long time with high trust and
MMC.
CMMC is starting to boil down by 2028. If you're not talking about CMMC, you certainly will be. But and don't hold your breath, but that's still there. And so you have to be an MSP that's been vetted and certified to go through that. And so when you've mastered the managed control configuration, it's already, like you said, it's already baked into your DNA at that point. And so it just becomes much, much easier to deliver it.
So Kyle, back to you, the opportunity discussions that you're having, assume that it's not an MSP who says, I have to have this because I was told I have to have it, which is, it's a small segment of the market, of the total MSP market, right? I mean, it's probably 1%, 2%, maybe. The rest of the MSPs, are you getting MSPs who are not yet certified or audited, but they're starting to pick up chatter from customers about their compliance, and so it's almost driving up through the MSP. So it's different than a customer who previously said, I can't work with you unless you're certified or audited. This is a customer who says to an uncertified MSP, can you help me? Which is an interesting scenario, but is that happening?
Certainly. And that's why we speak so much about compliance as a service as a great opportunity, because for MSPs that do have clients that need to maintain a SOC 2 audit annually, the MSP is involved in that process, whether they want to be or not, through the managed controls, which we've been talking about here today. And so for the MSPs that decide not to get certified and still support clients that need to maintain a SOC 2, it's only a matter of time before an auditor starts saying, hey, one of your vendors, I've noticed they're not SOC 2 compliant. Have you guys done your due diligence on them? Are they planning on becoming compliant? And that's a conversation that doesn't need to happen if you take the proactive approach and get ahead of it.
So I don't want to spend too much on this next point, because I think that it's probably going to end up being a future episode, just because it comes up so frequently in conversations that I have. And that's about picking the right framework, right? I hear so many MSPs talk about frameworks as if each framework represents a unique challenge. It's almost like I have to run this race over here, and this is the CMMC framework race, and I have to run the SOC 2 race over here, and I have to run the ISO 27001 race over here, and they treat them all like very, very different things. That seems to me a dangerous and very expensive approach, Chris. Is that, what would your guidance be for people who are dealing with multi-framework conversations, but they don't know, to Kyle's point, they don't know where to start with their own internal controls? So they're almost chasing the controls of their customer, right? Instead of looking at their own controls to be managed controls. What would you say?
Well, the conversation is simple. If you're an MSP, you pick the one that meets the MSP market needs and is a jack of all trades and really a master of none, right? Which is what it comes down to when dealing with compliance, because each individual customer is going to have their own needs. And so when you demonstrate the compliance, total governance compliance, not just information security and data management, which is what I think we see a lot of the cybersecurity frameworks focusing on the fringes of configurations and access. And although that's very important, it's not going to stop a bad actor who wants to get in, and they're going to come from what angle, whatever angle it takes.
Could you, I think that's really important. Could we elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think that is a hugely under discussed topic. I feel so many MSPs say, like, oh, if you only study CMMC, you're going to be a great MSP. Or if you only study the trust services criteria for SOC 2, or if you only study CIS, right? And everyone's got their own pet project framework. Walk us through maybe some of the more relevant, easy to understand scenarios of where that cyber framework would leave something unanswered. Maybe that's putting you too much on the spot. I'm trying to think of some of the things, like that are MSP specific, an MSP specific control that isn't really fleshed out in these other frameworks?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's thought provoking, and so the example that I would use is the mom and pop shop that is doing, let's say they're doing a very large percentage of their work is not with the, and I'm picking on CMMC because it's easy to do, but I'm going to choose one of the mom and pop shops that the DIB is relying to make a part for something like a fighter, the Joint Strike Fighter.
A bolt.
A bolt, right?
Yeah.
The mom and shop might only be doing a very small percentage of their actual business inside of that enclave or that ecosystem that's handling the contracts which contain the sensitive information. And then ultimately, once those contracts are sent in and then sent back out, it's largely a transactional result. The APT is not going to target that part of the industry, not going to target that part. They're going to target somebody who has access to the information and they're not well versed in the cybersecurity hygiene, right? Like things like making sure that you're not writing down your passwords onto a notebook, right? And so the MSP cannot prevent the customer from writing down their passwords on a notebook or on scratch paper that they keep in their door, right? Or that they keep it in their desk somewhere. But what the MSP can do is they can initiate things like cybersecurity awareness training on an ongoing basis, and they can essentially train the customer, or at least provide that training that would address some of the social engineering type of events that we've seen recently, right? Preventing those types of scenarios, because they're not going to target the person with the most access. They're going to generally target the person who's easiest to get to.
I think that's incredibly important. Chris, do you believe that there are controls or frameworks that look at a organization very differently than we would look at an MSP?
I do. I think that there are frameworks, very popular frameworks such as SOC 2, that look at an organization from the organization determines the importance of the controls. And so therefore they set their own internal controls, and then the auditor tests the organization based on the internal controls the organization has set. In contrast to that, when you have a cybersecurity framework that is based on best practices and is a jack of all trades, then the standard is set by a governing body that also is working in and out of the industry. So an industry specific framework like the UCS, where there's a membership community, a massive membership community, pointing out the relevance of each one of those controls year over year.
And Kyle, you again, to your everyday activities with MSPs, you're not dealing with direct one-on-one, very clean, like an MSP only concerned with or only dealing with a CMMC set of customers. I mean, it almost never, even with highly specialized MSP shops, I don't think that we ever see really that level of a one-on-one. It's almost always multi-framework environments. Is that true?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The only exception, and it's a very rare exception, is an MSP that only focuses on dental offices. But even within that, no two dentist offices are going to need the same amount of support. There might be a small, one hygienist, one dentist shop, and then you've got another orthopedic specialist that has multiple dentists and half a dozen to a dozen hygienists. So it varies even within that very narrow target market.
Right. But that gets to my point, which is we all know that there are service providers, there are MSPs and there are SaaS companies out there who have that more vertical focus, right? Let's just take medical. Why would anyone say that, oh, let's go to an MSP who has adopted CMMC as their only set of controls to be delivered downstream as a managed service, right? To a dental office, that would be like speaking Klingon, right? To a Vulcan, right? I guess that went over a lot of people's heads if you're not a Trekkie.
Yeah.
Right, but what would a dental office manager or a dentist say to controlled unclassified information when they're talking about, something else, right? They're talking about patient data. They're talking about health records. They're not talking about, defense industrial base, right? That's the problem with taking the frameworks out of the context of it has to start first with your MSP controls. And they cannot be so influenced as they are only healthcare controls or they're only DIB, DoD controls or they're only ISO controls. They have to be your controls, your industry's controls, because that really, seems to unlock all the magic that you guys are talking about.
Yeah,
Exactly. It's building their own Rosetta Stone that can then be applied and used for multiple.
Yeah. So, Chris, just some closing remarks. If you're out there as an MSP and they're listening to us right now and they want to know, okay, guys, I'm bought in. I get the concept, managed controls, got it. How do I get started? What's the best, easiest starting point if they want to start tapping into this and really, really leveraging managed controls?
Yeah, certification, getting certified through
The MSP you're talking about.
the MSP. Yeah,
Yeah.
getting certified, because the managed control configuration takes place post testing of the control. You don't go to a service provider. You don't go to a ticketing platform that says, yes, we plan on implementing a lot of compliance controls after we launch the product and make some money, and then we'll pay for the compliance on the tail end, right? You want to see the Carfax first, right? When you buy the car, you want to see the report. And so have the report on hand, ready to go, right? If you got to start in level 1, breeze through it. It could take as little as a week to get through that if you're motivated, positive mental attitude. And so, but then get the certification in hand, and then you can immediately toggle the managed control switch on and start downstream selling your compliance controls, compliance as a service.
So it sounds like it's not that big of a lift. It can be done. It can be done by even the smallest of MSPs. We have very, very large multinational, billion-dollar revenue MSPs in the program and mid-market as well. So, I mean, everybody can make it work. It's really about how serious do you want to be about this and how dominant in your own market do you want to be? I think personally, Kyle, I mean, this, be curious as to your thoughts on this, talking to MSPs. This is going to become a major differentiator. If not soon, it may already be now, where if you're talking to an MSP and they don't understand managed controls, you're going to start talking to other people who do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think MSPs need to understand this in and out themselves and then take the time to educate their current clients on this. Make sure their sales team is aware of it so they can educate prospects on it. And it's really going to help shape the prospect's perspective of, I'm just trying to find a company that can manage our IT, to I'm looking for a trusted advisor to my company that is going to do so much more than just manage our IT.
I love it, guys. Yeah, this is really the big. Don't look at and stop treating compliance as an expense. It isn't. It's an opportunity. It's a revenue opportunity. You have to be invested in it. You have to be able to do the work and to be able to understand the concepts. And we'll help you understand the material. But once you do, that's when you start to see some really cool things happen. Chris, to your point, your MSP practice suddenly, becomes a little bit better, sometimes a lot better, right? I know we've seen some remarkable before and after pictures of before, Cyber Verify, after Cyber Verify. They look, they were a little flabby, a little out of shape, a little winded after a short run, and they come out the other end and they're a little more leaner, a little more aggressive. They a little more efficient. It's a nice thing to see.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's necessary because the people that they're serving, we want to protect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, folks, managed controls, there it is. If you have questions, let us know. It is a complicated topic. We're going to talk about this issue a lot more, in coming months. But it's a necessary concept that you need to master. And if you have questions, we are here to help you. And once you do, things will look a lot better for you and for your customers, and you will have a much stickier, more valuable relationship with your customers. Guarantee it. Stay tuned. Until next time.